Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We're going to be presenting environmental justice and voting rights and how exactly they align. So my name is Shukriya, and I'm 15 years old, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a freshman in high school, and I'm the lead for the San Diego Youth Climate Strike, and I'm also on the policy team for California.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm a 16-year-old sophomore in high school. I also use she, her pronouns, and I'm the co-lead for the San Diego chapter, and I'm on the Outreach California team. So before we start, we're going to let you know what we're going to talk about today. So first, we're going to go into depth about what environmental justice movement is, as well as the voting rights movement. And we're going to see how they align, as well as the differences between the environmental justice movement and the climate justice movement. There are a few important key terms to look at. So first of all, environmental justice. It's the social movement which focuses on the fair distribution of environmental benefits and burdens. Climate justice is a term used to frame global warming as an ethical and political issue, rather than one which is purely environmental. And later on in the presentation, we're going to talk about what each of those really mean. Voting rights is the rights of participation in elections, and especially public elections. And the Voting Rights Act is a federal legislation in the US which prohibits racial discrimination in voting.
The Shelby County versus Holder case was a Supreme Court case which led to two pieces of the Voting Rights Act being removed, and this made it easier to pass discriminatory laws. We'll go more in depth on what that case and what went down. The 15th Amendment states that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. So this was the amendment that allowed African Americans to vote. And then we have the Green New Deal, which is a proposed United States legislation which addresses climate change and economic inequality. It lays out a grand plan for tracking climate change. This is more of a general definition. The Green New Deal is definitely, there's more depth to it. There's gerrymandering, which is a practice intended to establish an unfair political advantage for a particular group or group by manipulating district boundaries, which is most commonly used in first past the post-electoral systems.
And before we talk about what the environmental justice movement is, we want to look at the historical context. So the environmental justice movement was started by individuals, primarily of color, who wanted to address the inequity of environmental protection in their communities. The first important date to look at is the February 11th, 1968 Memphis sanitation strike. This was the first time that African Americans mobilized a nation to speak out against environmental injustices in their communities and in the whole nation. This was caused after the deaths of two sanitation workers because of lack of environmental protection in their community and no response from the government. Later on, in September of 1982, there was a sit-in in Warren County, North Carolina, against the PCB landfill. This was caused because the government was willing to place a hazardous landfill in Warren County, North Carolina, against the residents' wishes. This was the second time that African Americans mobilized a nation, and it was a nonviolent sit-in, and over 500 environmentalists and civil rights activists were arrested. And even though their protest wasn't successful in stopping the construction of the landfill, it was successful in causing a spark that led to the environmental justice movement. So although we can't pinpoint the exact date for the beginning of this movement, this was a major event that led to what we know today as the environmental justice movement. Now, in June of 1983, there was a General Accounting Office study, and this was created by the United States General Accounting Office using 1980 census data because of what happened in the Warren County sit-in. This study showed that in 3 out of 4 hazardous waste landfills, there were around 26% of the population who were African Americans and whose families were below the income level, so they were at poverty level. And that led to the 1987 Toxic Waste in the United States, and this was a different study. This study was created by the United Church of Christ Commission on Racial Justice, and this study examined the relationship between the location of the hazardous waste sites and the population of the communities, specifically looking at racial and socioeconomic aspects. And this study showed that over 15 million African Americans, 8 million Hispanic, and over half of all Asian and Pacific Islanders, as well as Native Americans, resided in communities with at least one abandoned or uncontrolled toxic waste site. This is crucial because it was the first study to show the racial and social and environmental issues present in the nation. And finally, in 1990, the Indigenous Environmental Network was founded. And this is an alliance of Indigenous environmental justice activists, and they are advocating both for the world and the climate, global warming and climate crisis, as well as more Indigenous rights.
Okay, so the historical context of the voting rights. So the whole voting rights movement was a movement that African Americans and those affected by voter suppression have put together to try and resolve or bring awareness to ever since 1869, which is when the 15th Amendment was passed to allow African Americans to vote. And then in 1896, the Louisiana passes the grandfather clauses, which is was a law to keep former slaves and their descendants from voting. And as a result, the percentage of registered Black voters dropped from 44% in 1896 to 4% 4 years later. Then Mississippi, South Carolina, Alabama, and Virginia followed Louisiana's lead and by enacting their own grandfather clauses. And then in 1965, the President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act into law, permanently barring barriers to political participation by racial and ethnic minorities, prohibiting any election practice that denies the right to vote on account of race, and requiring jurisdictions with a history of discrimination in voting to get federal approval for changes in their elections, in their election laws before they can take any effect. So we have this short video of his little speech.
There is no constitutional issue here. The command of the Constitution is plain. There is no moral issue. It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country.
So then later on in 2011, this is obviously a huge difference in time, but in 2011, voter suppression was on the rise. A record number of restrictions to voting were introduced in state legislators nationwide, including photo ID requirements, cut to early voting, and restrictions to voter registration. And many of those states have histories of voter discrimination and are covered under the VRA, which is the Voting Rights Act. And in 2013, that was when the Supreme Court case Shelby County versus Holder was closed. And again, I mentioned earlier, this was the case that made it easier to pass discriminatory laws.
So now we're going to talk about what the environmental justice movement really is. So the environmental justice movement deals with the distribution of environmental benefits, and this includes attractive and extensive green space, clean air and water, parks and beaches, and investment in fighting pollution, as well as in improving landscapes. This movement is also about relieving the burdens that people experience at home, work, where they learn, and where they play, basically where they live their lives. And this movement tends to focus on groups and communities instead of individuals, so it has a more holistic approach to analyzing and addressing problems and reforms. And this movement also includes an aspect of social justice, but sometimes social and environmental goals may be in conflict. Now we're going to look at environmental justice and climate justice and how they align. But before we start, we just want to make it clear that this isn't very black or white, because the climate justice movement came about after the environmental justice movement. But there are some key things that each movement focuses on, which is independent to the other. So first off, we'll talk about the environmental justice movement. This movement focuses on the fair treatment of all people, which includes equal access to elected officials and equal representation. This movement emerged as a concept in literature and public discourse when communities of color were closer to toxic waste sites and no one was doing anything about it. And it later also included the environment of marginalized groups. So basically what this movement does is it connects the abuse of environment with oppression of people with the least power in this country, which are people of color, women, and immigrants. And the movement focuses on injustices due to the environment.
Yeah, so the climate justice movement. So climate change isn't only an environmental issue. Its ethical and political issues connect to global warming and climate change. And communities which contribute the least to causing the climate change will most likely suffer the most, and they will have the least amount of resources. Like we mentioned earlier, the environmental and climate justice movements are very black and white. They're really similar. There's just certain things that are different. So its greatest effects will be felt by marginalized communities, and it's related to uneven distribution of climate change exposure. So unless it's properly dealt with, the climate change will worsen equity issues in the United States, and it builds on environmental justice, social justice, and human rights.
Now we want to mention a few similarities. So first of all, both movements focus on fighting for a more democratically inclusive world for everyone, as well as giving opportunities to those who are most affected and silenced in our country and in our world, as well as recognizing and fighting to stop the disproportionate burdens on minorities related to environment injustices. And these are people of color and immigrants and women. And both movements focus on the impacts that climate change has on society and on social issues which are present in our country and in our world. And both movements want an equal burden on everyone because they don't think it's fair that some people feel it more than others.
I was muted. Okay, so voting rights. The legal definition is the rights of participation in especially public elections. So though voting has always been one of the many ways of building and exercising power and holding elected officials accountable to the communities they are supposed to represent, we're all being called upon again to support this most basic right. So no matter race, color, gender, every person should be able to exercise the right to vote. So in a court case called Shelby County versus Holder, like I mentioned earlier, the Supreme Court's conservative majority took down pieces of the Voting Rights Act, and this made it easier for most states to pass discriminatory laws, and people of color and all across America had to continuously fight against voting discrimination. So what exactly were those pieces? So since 2010, many state governments have shielded themselves from accountability through tactics that weaken democratic institutions by selectively suppressing or diluting votes, with communities of color and low-income communities as the most frequent targets. So barriers to eligibility were one of those tactics, where felon disenfranchisement, restricting times and processes for registering voters. There was this made it hard for people to go and be qualified to even go and vote. So barriers to voting, removing or limiting early voting, reducing the number of polling places available in marginalized communities. You wouldn't really expect them to remove amount of polling places, but that's what they did, and this affected a lot of people because they weren't able to vote. And yeah, biased representation was manipulating the design of legislative districts to entrench racial advantage. So communities targeted by such policies are disproportionately likely to face severe environmental burdens, such as air and water pollution. Voter suppression and gerrymandering are effectively give polluting industries a green light to continue harming residents of these communities. Furthermore, there's a vicious cycle relationship between illness and voter suppression. Health problems in a community tend to depress voter turnout, further limiting the community's ability to use the democratic process to protect itself.
Now that we've talked about the environmental justice movement as well as the voting rights movement, we're going to look at how they align. So first of all, both movements believe that in order to ensure the government is protecting us against the climate crisis, we have to vote people into office who have our best environmental interests in mind and who are willing to do what it takes to stop this crisis. And this is important for both local and national government officials. Local government officials are in charge of deciding landfill locations and waste disposal practices, while national government officials are in charge of the national climate policies that are present in our country. So both of these are important for different reasons. And the environmental movement needs as many voters as possible to hold governments and companies accountable for what they're doing to harm our world. And the Green New Deal is a piece of legislation that both movements believe in because it aligns with their goals and their values. Another important thing where they align is that people who are most vulnerable to voter discrimination are also the people who are most vulnerable to localized pollution, which includes drilling, refining, and industrial operations, which are some of the main reasons for climate change. Without a clean environment, our lives and our futures are at risk. These risks are even greater for the very same communities threatened by restrictions of voting rights, and they are the ones who are most affected by environmental problems, yet they are the ones who contribute the least to causing these environmental problems. So basically, it comes down to this. Without protecting voting rights, there will be no protection of environmental rights. So both movements have to work together in order to accomplish their goals.
Yeah, so what can we learn from all of this that we just mentioned? So the climate justice was a movement that was created from environmental justice. So they both align very similarly, looking at the moral and ethical consequences. Environmental justice is dependent on voting rights. Movements which focus on social justice, human rights, and make sure freedom and rights are upheld should work together, even if the first connection isn't obvious, like, for example, environmental justice and voting rights. In the beginning of the presentation, you were probably thinking how they were similar, but as you could see, there were very similar and significance in the two movements.
Another really important aspect to remember is that the people who are affected most by the climate crisis are the same people who are discriminated and vulnerable to voting discrimination. These are people of color, marginalized communities, and low-income areas. These are also the communities which contribute the least to causing climate change. And the most important thing from today's presentation is that no voting rights leads to no environmental justice. So it's crucial that these two movements work together.
So how to get involved in these movements, and you could get in touch with your local USYCS chapter, and you could join the movement at youthclimatestrikeus.org. You could join your local NAACP chapter. They work with voting rights, and they actually have a medium on their website about how environmental justice and voting rights align. You could attend virtual strikes and movements to better educate yourself. And if you're over 18, please make sure to vote at this upcoming election.
So now we're wondering if you guys have any questions.
Yeah, so there are some questions in the question box. First one says, what rights does environmental justice provide? Do you want to answer that, or?
Sure, I can answer that. So the environmental justice movement focuses on the environment, but it also focuses on human rights. So that's why, as I mentioned before, there is an alliance of indigenous communities which are fighting for environmental rights, because fighting for environmental rights is also about fighting for indigenous rights and about fighting for rights of the people who are in communities of low income or people of color or immigrants, because, like we previously mentioned, those are the people who are most impacted by this crisis. So it's really one and the same. Fighting for these environmental issues is fighting for human rights.
Yeah, that was a good answer. I would agree. Who does voter suppression most affect? I can answer that question. So basically, voter suppression affects people who are in marginalized communities, low income areas, and people of color the most. And that links to people in marginalized communities, low income areas, and all of that. They get affected the most by pollution and the things that cause climate change. So that's how those two align, but voter suppression affects those three categories the most. Okay, the next question was more info on environmental injustice. Do you want to answer that?
Sure. So, well, if you want more information than what we already said, there are a lot of places online where you can look at, and the US Youth Climate Strike website has a lot of things. But we just wanted to give you like the basis of this because it's a very complex issue. But if you want me to go over it again, it's basically about fighting for the people who are underrepresented because they are the ones who suffer from this crisis. So the environmental justice movement is about looking at the social issues that come about because of the environmental issues. So it's not only about focusing on global warming, but on what how global warming will affect the people. And for example, there have been a lot of refugees because of the climate crisis, and there will continue to be more if we don't do anything to stop this. So those are the main issues that the environmental justice movement focuses on. It's about how the oppression of people is affected by the issues related to the climate.
Yeah, that was a good answer. Examples of voter suppression, I would say like how they removed polling places from marginalized communities. They, in 2011, I believe, they made ID requirement when you need to vote. That made it hard on some people because they didn't have IDs, or they couldn't afford to go to a DMV and get one. And I think that's it. Those are all the ones that I mentioned in the presentation.
This can also be relevant to what's going on today because with COVID-19, a lot of people won't want to go out to their polling places and vote. So that's why a lot of states are trying to get mail by ballots available so that people don't have to leave their houses. And California actually allows you to mail in your ballots. So this is a positive thing that our state is doing to help that.
Yeah. Thoughts on people with felony convictions voting? Do you want to go? I don't know.
I don't really understand the question.
Okay, so people who have felons, what are your thoughts on them voting?
Oh, felony. I heard phony. Okay, sorry. So I think that it's important for everyone to be able to have a voice, and elections are the place where people's voices can be heard. So I do think that it's important for felons to be able to vote because a lot of the times that is also related to racial injustice because there are higher amounts of African Americans who are incarcerated compared to whites or other races. So it's not only an issue about felons being able to vote, but it's an issue about race in this country. And our country has too many people who go to jail if you look at the numbers of people who are going to jail in other countries. So I definitely think that it's important for everyone to be able to have their voice heard in this country because that's what this country stands for.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think it's important that people realize that not all convicted felons are actually felons because the amount of African American people in jail are usually framed or they're were falsely convicted. So I think it's still important that they have the right to vote no matter what. Next question. How can people of low income and communities, how can people of low income communities learn more about their voting rights? I would say, okay, you can go ahead.
No, it's fine. I'll go after you.
Okay, I was gonna say, like, do your research, like, get in touch with your local NAACP chapter. There was a question asking what they do. They're the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. They were, like, formed in, I believe, like, this when the Civil Rights Movement started. So they're, like, a movement that supports African Americans and make sure they have their rights. So yeah, I would say get in touch with your local NAACP chapter, do your research, and attend webinars like these that can educate you about these issues.
Yeah, definitely. I could just add that there are, like she already said, the NAACP is just one of many organizations who are trying to teach people what their voting rights are. And also, in every polling location, there are the voting rights at the door for people to look at. So the sources are out there, and there are many organizations who want to make it easier for people to know their rights. Do we have
sorry, I was muted. There's one more question. What causes voter suppression? I don't know. I would say, like, what causes voter suppression? Just, like, the government being, you know, racist. Like, in general, I feel like it's just that them doing these things to low-income communities, and that is what voter suppression is. So I would say just, like, the discrimination.
Definitely. It's a discrimination of people, and also a lot of the times it's people not knowing their rights, which is why it's so important for everyone to know their rights. And this is because people take advantage of those who don't know their rights, because there are more rights than what people know of. And so if we make sure that people are as educated as they can be, then people will be less able to take advantage of that.
Hi, I'm Tiffany. I'm also just joining in, and I'll add on to this question. So we can also use, like, for example, Bernie's campaign as a reference for instances of voter suppression. We saw that in especially, like, certain colleges being targeted, low income minority communities being targeted. We saw, like, the lines, for example, at UCLA were, like, they took, like, 6 hours long for someone to go from the back to the front. And like, that is really discouraging to people who are voting for the first time in their lives, as well as, like, newly new citizens who have just immigrated and gotten, like, their citizenship status. It's also relating to them. So those are just, like, a few instances where we see, like, voting suppression.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this is our last question that I see so far. Why is voter suppression happening? I thought we answered that question. But yeah, it's just, like, them trying to discourage people from voting. So that's that. Do you want to add something, Natalie? Because I'm not really.
Sure. It also happens because people don't want a certain group or community to go out and vote because of the result. Because, for example, how Tiffany was saying about people who were going to vote for Bernie Sanders, their more youth were supporting Bernie Sanders, and if they can't go out there and vote, then there's going to be less votes for Bernie Sanders. So I think it's a mixture of just racism in the country as well as people scared of the outcome. And it's a horrible thing that is happening. And so we're trying to bring awareness to it so that it doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, and then like Tiffany added, we could see this also in how corporate media operates, not just the voting system itself. And yeah, that's 100% true. So I think that was our last question, but thank you guys all for coming. Natalie, you can go ahead and close.
Sure. These are our social media and places where you can access us and learn more about all these types of issues and all the upcoming events. And we just want to say thank you. And it's very important to stay educated on issues like this because we can do something about it to help stop these issues and to bring awareness to it. So we appreciate you guys coming and listening to us.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And before we close, just shout out to our tech person, Tyler. Thank you so much.